My name is Bethany, and I am 28 years old. Standing in this intensive care unit, watching my 6-year-old niece Emma and 4-year-old nephew Jake fighting for their lives through the glass window, I never imagined that my parents' Christmas gift would become a weapon of mass destruction. The honey they gave us 3 weeks ago, wrapped in beautiful golden ribbons with a card that read "For our precious daughter's family only," was laced with enough neurotoxin to kill an entire household. When my parents Harold and Margaret burst through those hospital doors and saw me standing there, their faces twisted with rage as they realized what I had done with their deadly present. Before I tell you how my own flesh and blood tried to murder me and my husband for money, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking family stories. You won't believe what happens next when the truth about my parents' twisted plan finally comes to light. 3 weeks earlier, Christmas morning had started like any other holiday celebration in our suburban Atlanta home. The living room was decorated with twinkling lights, and the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the air as my husband David and I prepared for my parents' arrival. I had built a successful marketing career over the past 8 years, and David worked as a software engineer for a major tech company. We lived comfortably in our 4-bedroom house, but I always felt the weight of my family's expectations pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. My sister Rachel lived across town with her 2 children, Emma and Jake. She had struggled financially ever since her divorce 2 years ago, working double shifts as a nurse just to make ends meet. Her small apartment was cramped, but she filled it with love and laughter that made our childhood home feel cold by comparison. Rachel had always been the family favorite until I started making real money, and then suddenly I became the golden child who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. When Harold and Margaret arrived that morning, they brought an unusual amount of luggage for what was supposed to be a simple Christmas visit. My father, a tall man with graying hair and sharp blue eyes, carried himself with the authority of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. My mother, always impeccably dressed even for casual occasions, had that smile she wore when she wanted something important but didn't want to ask directly. The gifts they brought were more elaborate than usual. David received an expensive watch, I got designer jewelry, but then my mother produced something special from her oversized purse. It was an elegant wooden box containing 6 jars of what she called artisanal honey from an exclusive European supplier. The jars were beautifully crafted with handwritten labels in what appeared to be French, and each one contained honey of a different color and consistency. "This is very special honey, darling," Margaret said, placing the box carefully on our coffee table. "It cost us nearly $2,000 to import this directly from a small monastery in the Swiss Alps. The monks there have been making this honey for over 300 years using ancient techniques that create healing properties you simply cannot find anywhere else in the world." She paused dramatically, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the edge of the wooden box. "But you must promise me something very important, Bethany. This honey is only for you and David. Do not share it with anyone else, especially not with Rachel or the children. Their digestive systems are not sophisticated enough to handle the potency of these rare ingredients." I found her warning strange and unnecessarily specific. Why would honey be too potent for children when honey was generally considered one of the safest natural foods for anyone over the age of 1 year? David raised his eyebrows at me from across the room, clearly thinking the same thing I was thinking. My parents had always been somewhat controlling, but this level of micromanagement felt different somehow. Harold then launched into an elaborate explanation about proper storage requirements. The honey needed to be kept at a specific temperature, consumed within certain time frames, and mixed with particular types of food to achieve maximum benefits. He handed me a typed instruction sheet that read like a scientific laboratory protocol rather than simple directions for eating honey. The language was unnecessarily complex, filled with warnings about adverse reactions and contraindications that made no sense for a natural food product. "Make sure you follow these instructions exactly," Harold emphasized, tapping the paper with his index finger. "This is not regular grocery store honey, Bethany. This is a powerful natural medicine that requires respect and careful handling. If you deviate from these guidelines, you could experience serious digestive problems or worse." The way he said or were sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why at the time. As the day progressed, I noticed my parents asking repeated questions about our daily routines, meal schedules, and upcoming travel plans. They seemed particularly interested in when David and I would be home together for extended periods, and whether we had any house guests planned for the coming weeks. Margaret kept steering the conversation back to the honey, reminding me multiple times about the storage instructions and emphasizing how expensive and rare this gift was supposed to be. That evening, after my parents had gone back to their hotel, I was cleaning up the kitchen when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. In the trash can, I found a crumpled piece of paper that had fallen out of Harold's coat pocket. It was a receipt from a local hardware store for a substance called sodium fluoroacetate, along with protective gloves and a small mixing container. I had never heard of sodium fluoroacetate before, but something about finding a chemical receipt on Christmas Day felt deeply wrong. David found me standing there holding the receipt with trembling hands. "What is that?" he asked, and I showed him what I had discovered. He immediately pulled out his phone and started searching for information about sodium fluoroacetate. What we found made us both feel sick to our stomachs. Sodium fluoroacetate was a highly toxic pesticide that was banned for residential use in most countries because of its potential to cause severe poisoning and death in humans and animals. "Why would your father have a receipt for poison?" David asked, his face pale in the kitchen lighting. I stared at the beautiful wooden box sitting on our counter and felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The pieces were starting to fit together in a pattern that I desperately did not want to see, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. That night, I called my bank to check on some financial accounts I had not looked at in several months. What I discovered made everything click into place with terrifying clarity. Someone had been making inquiries about my life insurance policies, investment accounts, and the trust fund I had inherited from my grandmother 3 years earlier. The inquiries were coming from an address I recognized as my parents' home, and they had been happening regularly for the past 6 months. The next morning, I confronted my parents at their hotel with the receipt I had found and printouts of the financial inquiries they had been making. Harold's face went through a series of expressions, from surprise to anger to something that looked almost like relief that their secret was finally out in the open. Margaret immediately went into damage control mode, but her usual charm felt forced and desperate. "You don't understand the situation we're in, Bethany," Harold said, slumping into the hotel room chair like a defeated man. "I made some investments that went bad. Very bad. I owe people money that I don't have, and they're not the kind of people who accept payment plans or forgiveness." His hand shook as he lit a cigarette, something I had never seen him do before in my entire life. Margaret paced back and forth across the small hotel room, her high heels clicking against the thin carpet. "Your father got involved with some business associates who promised guaranteed returns on our retirement savings. We put everything into their investment scheme, including the money we had saved for our long-term care and medical expenses. When the market shifted, we lost it all in a matter of weeks." But that was just the beginning of their financial nightmare, as Harold continued to explain with growing desperation in his voice. He had tried to recover their losses by borrowing money from increasingly dangerous sources. First it was legitimate bank loans secured against their house, then credit cards with astronomical interest rates, and finally loans from what he euphemistically called private lenders who operated outside traditional banking systems. "I owe $350,000 to people who break legs for fun," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've given me until the end of January to pay them back with interest, or they're going to start hurting people I care about. That includes you, Bethany. They know where you live, where you work, and what your daily schedule looks like." Margaret's secret was even more shocking than Harold's gambling debts. Over the past 5 years, she had spent nearly $200,000 on cosmetic surgeries, luxury vacations, and designer goods that she charged to credit cards in both her name and Harold's name without telling him. She had also been seeing a psychiatrist for what she described as severe depression and anxiety but had been hiding her medication and therapy bills from Harold for fear that he would force her to stop treatment. I deserve to look good and feel good about myself, Margaret said defiantly, even as tears streamed down her carefully made-up face. I spent 40 years raising children and taking care of your father while he built his career. I sacrificed my own dreams and ambitions so that our family could succeed, and now that our children are grown, I wanted to spend some money on myself for once in my life. The revelation that hit me hardest was learning about the changes they had made to my life insurance policies and estate planning documents. Margaret produced a folder filled with legal paperwork that I had supposedly signed during a family dinner 6 months earlier, when I thought I was just signing some routine documents related to my grandmother's estate settlement. In reality, I had unknowingly signed papers that made my parents the primary beneficiaries of my life insurance, investment accounts, and trust fund in the event of my death. We didn't want to worry you with all these financial problems, Harold said, trying to justify their deception. We thought we could solve everything quietly and put the insurance policies back to normal before you ever found out. But time is running out, and we're getting desperate. These people I owe money to don't care about family relationships or ethical considerations. They want their money, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it. I demanded to know exactly what their plan had been with the poisoned honey. Margaret broke down completely and admitted that they had been planning to gradually poison David and me over the course of several weeks, making it look like we had contracted some kind of rare illness that would explain our declining health and eventual deaths. The honey was supposed to be consumed slowly, with the toxin building up in our systems until it caused organ failure that would appear natural to medical examiners. We convinced ourselves that it would be quick and painless, Margaret sobbed. Harold found someone who promised that you wouldn't suffer, that you would just go to sleep one day and not wake up. We thought it would be better than letting those criminals hurt you in more violent ways. At least this way, your deaths would serve a purpose by saving our lives and paying off our debts. David, who had been silent throughout this entire conversation, finally exploded with anger that I had never seen from him before. "You're talking about murdering your own daughter for money," he said, his voice filled with disgust and disbelief. "You're not desperate parents trying to protect your family. You're calculating criminals who were willing to commit the ultimate betrayal for financial gain." The argument that followed was unlike anything our family had ever experienced. Harold became physically aggressive, grabbing my arm and demanding that I agree to help them solve their financial problems through legitimate means. He wanted me to take out additional loans against my house, liquidate my retirement accounts, and ask David's parents for money to help cover their debts. Margaret switched between pleading and threatening, alternately begging for forgiveness and warning me about what would happen if I didn't cooperate with their demands. "Those people know about Rachel and the children," she said menacingly. "If something happens to your father and me because we can't pay our debts, do you really think they'll leave the rest of the family alone? Your sister and those kids could get caught up in this mess whether you help us or not." I realized that my parents had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They were not the people who had raised me, loved me, and supported me throughout my childhood and young adulthood. They had become strangers who saw me as nothing more than a financial resource to be exploited for their own survival, regardless of the cost to my life, my marriage, or my future. That day marked the beginning of a war between me and my parents that would escalate to levels of betrayal and violence I never could have imagined. As I left their hotel room, I knew that I was walking into the most dangerous period of my life, where the people who should have protected me were now my greatest threat. Within 48 hours of our confrontation at the hotel, my parents launched their first systematic attack on my life and marriage. I discovered their initial strategy when David came home from work with a confused and angry expression that immediately put me on high alert. He threw his briefcase down on the kitchen counter and turned to face me with an intensity one had never seen before in our 5 years of marriage. "I need you to explain something to me," David said, his voice controlled but clearly struggling with some powerful emotions. "I got a very interesting phone call today from your mother. She told me some things about you that I'm hoping aren't true, but I need to hear your side of the story before I decide what to believe." Margaret had called David at his office and spent nearly an hour telling him elaborate lies about my supposed infidelity and financial deception. According to her story, I had been having a secret affair with a coworker for the past 8 months, and I had been using money from our joint accounts to pay for hotel rooms, expensive gifts, and romantic getaways with this other man. She even provided David with specific dates, times, and locations where these alleged encounters had supposedly taken place. But the lies didn't stop with claims about infidelity. Margaret had also told David that I had been secretly gambling online, accumulating massive debts that I was hiding from him by using a private credit card account. She claimed that I was facing bankruptcy and had been planning to steal money from his retirement fund to cover my gambling losses without telling him about my financial problems. The most damaging lie was her claim that I had been planning to divorce David and take half of his assets, including his share of our house, his retirement savings, and even the classic car he had been restoring for the past 3 years. According to Margaret's story, I had already consulted with a divorce attorney and had been gathering documentation about his finances in preparation for filing papers that would leave him with almost nothing. To support these lies, Harold had somehow obtained forged documents that appeared to show credit card statements, hotel receipts, and even what looked like email correspondence between me and this fictional lover. The forgeries were sophisticated enough to fool someone who wasn't looking for signs of manipulation, and they included details that made the story seem believable to someone who wanted to trust the source of the information. David confronted me with printed copies of these forged documents, and I could see the pain and confusion in his eyes as he tried to reconcile the woman he loved with the person described in these fabricated papers. "Your mother seemed really concerned about you," he said quietly. "She said she's been worried about changes in your behavior for months, and she finally decided she had to tell me because she was afraid I was going to get hurt financially and emotionally." I spent the next 6 hours proving my innocence by going through our bank statements, credit card records, phone bills, and even security footage from my office building. Every document and piece of evidence clearly showed that I had been exactly where I said I was during the times when I was supposedly conducting this secret affair. My work schedule, gym visits, grocery shopping trips, and evening activities were all documented in ways that made Margaret's story impossible to be true. The really insidious part of my parents' plan was how they had constructed these lies to exploit David's deepest insecurities about our relationship. David had always worried that I earned significantly more money than he did, and he sometimes felt intimidated by my success in the corporate world. Margaret's story about gambling and financial deception played directly into his fears that I might be living a secret life that he didn't understand or couldn't access. Once I had definitively proven that the documents were forgeries and the story was completely fabricated, David's confusion turned to anger at my parents for trying to manipulate him. But the damage to our relationship had already been done. Even though he believed me intellectually, there was now a seed of doubt planted in his mind that would take time and effort to overcome completely. The next phase of their attack targeted my professional reputation through a campaign of anonymous complaints and false accusations. Over the following week, my company's human resources department received multiple reports claiming that I had been engaging in unethical business practices, including accepting bribes from clients, falsifying expense reports, and sexually harassing junior employees. These accusations were serious enough that my supervisor was required to launch an internal investigation that temporarily suspended me from client-facing responsibilities while they conducted interviews and reviewed financial records. Even though the investigation ultimately cleared me of all wrongdoing, the process was humiliating and damaging to relationships I had built with colleagues and clients over many years. During this same period, my parents began a systematic campaign to turn extended family members against me by spreading their version of events about our Christmas confrontation. They told aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends that I had become unstable and paranoid, accusing them of terrible things without any evidence. According to their story, I was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown that was causing me to lash out at the people who loved me most. Margaret was particularly effective at playing the role of the concerned mother who was heartbroken by her daughter's inexplicable behavior. She told relatives that I had refused their generous Christmas gift and had accused them of trying to poison me, which sounded absolutely insane when presented without the context of the sodium fluoroacetate receipt and the forged insurance documents. Harold supported Margaret's performance by playing the role of the dignified father who was more disappointed than angry about his daughter's accusations. He told people that he was worried about my marriage, my career, and my mental health, and he asked for their support in staging some kind of family intervention to help me get the psychological treatment I obviously needed. The result of their campaign was that I found myself increasingly isolated from people who had been part of my support system for my entire life. Cousins who had been like siblings to me suddenly became cold and distant. Aunts who had always been warm and welcoming now looked at me with suspicion and pity. Family friends who had known me since childhood began treating me like I was fragile or dangerous. At the same time, my parents were escalating their financial pressure by demanding immediate access to my trust fund and investment accounts. They showed up at my house unannounced, called me at work multiple times per day, and sent increasingly desperate text messages about deadlines they claimed to be facing with their mysterious creditors. The psychological warfare was taking its toll on both David and me. We were both losing sleep, constantly looking over our shoulders, and beginning to question our own judgment about what was real and what was manipulation. My parents had succeeded in creating chaos and uncertainty in every area of my life, and I was starting to understand that their Christmas gift had been just the beginning of a much larger and more sophisticated plan to destroy me completely. By the end of January, I realized that I was fighting for more than just my life and marriage. I was fighting for my sanity, my reputation, and my ability to trust my own perceptions about reality. My parents had weaponized every relationship and institution that was supposed to provide safety and support, turning them into sources of doubt and danger instead. The breaking point came when I decided to hire a private investigator named Jackson Mitchell, a former police detective who specialized in family fraud and insurance scams. Jackson was a quiet man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes who had seen enough family betrayal to understand the depths of human greed and manipulation without being shocked by my story. "Your parents are not amateurs," Jackson told me during our first meeting in his downtown office. "The sophistication of those forged documents and the coordination of their attacks on multiple fronts suggests they've either done this before or they're working with someone who has extensive experience in this type of fraud scheme." Jackson's investigation started with a deep dive into my parents' financial records, travel history, and personal associations going back 5 years. What he discovered was a pattern of behavior that painted a picture of two people who had been living far beyond their means for much longer than they had admitted to me. Harold's gambling debts were real, but they were just the tip of an iceberg that included tax evasion, investment fraud, and connections to organized crime. The most shocking revelation came when Jackson traced the source of the sodium fluoroacetate that Harold had purchased. The hardware store receipt led us to a supplier who specialized in providing restricted chemicals to licensed pest control companies, but who was also willing to sell to individuals who could provide fake credentials and pay premium prices for discretion. Jackson discovered that Harold had purchased enough sodium fluoroacetate to poison an entire neighborhood, not just 2 people. The quantity suggested that my parents were either planning multiple murders or they were part of a larger operation that involved eliminating several victims around the same time. The chemical supplier remembered Harold specifically because he had asked detailed questions about detection methods and how to disguise the substance in common food products. But the investigation revealed something even more disturbing than I had imagined. Jackson found evidence that my parents had been systematically researching and targeting other family members for potential accidents over the past 3 years. They had taken out life insurance policies on my Uncle Thomas, my cousin Jennifer, and even on Rachel and her children without any of us knowing about it. Uncle Thomas had died of an apparent heart attack 8 months earlier at the age of 57, which the family had accepted as a tragic but not entirely unexpected event given his history of high blood pressure and stress from his demanding job as a construction foreman. However, Jackson's investigation revealed that Thomas had changed his will just 6 weeks before his death, making Harold and Margaret the beneficiaries of his life insurance policy and his share of a family property that was worth nearly $500,000. Medical records that Jackson obtained through legal channels showed that Thomas had been experiencing symptoms consistent with slow poisoning in the weeks leading up to his death. He had been complaining about nausea, fatigue, and neurological problems that his doctors had attributed to work-related stress and poor diet. The symptoms had been gradually worsening, exactly the way they would if someone were being given small doses of toxin over an extended period. My cousin Jennifer's car accident was equally suspicious when viewed through the lens of Jackson's investigation. Jennifer had been driving home from work on a rainy evening when her brakes had allegedly failed, causing her car to slide through a guardrail and roll down an embankment. She had survived the crash but suffered serious injuries that required months of hospitalization and rehabilitation. Jackson discovered that Jennifer's car had been serviced at a garage owned by one of Harold's business associates just 2 days before the accident occurred. The brake failure that caused the crash had been attributed to a manufacturing defect, but the insurance investigation had been suspiciously brief and superficial. More importantly, Harold and Margaret had been named as emergency contacts on Jennifer's insurance policies, giving them access to information about her coverage and medical condition throughout her recovery. The pattern that emerged from Jackson's investigation was terrifying in its scope and calculation. My parents had been systematically targeting family members who had significant assets or insurance coverage, using their positions as trusted relatives to gain access to financial information and establish themselves as beneficiaries. They had been patient and methodical, spacing out the accidents to avoid suspicion and varying their methods to make each incident appear unrelated to the others. Jackson also uncovered the identity of Harold's criminal associates, who turned out to be part of a sophisticated insurance fraud ring that operated across multiple states. This organization specialized in recruiting middle-class families to participate in staged accidents and murders in exchange for sharing the insurance payouts. Harold and Margaret were not just victims of circumstance who had gotten desperate about their debts. They were active participants in a criminal enterprise that had been operating for at least 5 years. The honey that my parents had given us for Christmas was just the latest iteration of a poisoning method they had refined through trial and error on other victims. The European monastery story was completely fabricated, and the beautiful packaging was designed to make the gift seem expensive and special, encouraging us to consume it regularly and in significant quantities. Jackson's investigation revealed that the neurotoxin had been carefully calculated to cause gradual organ failure over a period of 4 to 6 weeks, depending on body weight and consumption patterns. The symptoms would have started as mild digestive problems and fatigue, progressing to neurological issues, and finally culminating in cardiac arrest or respiratory failure that would appear to be natural causes to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for signs of poisoning. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was that my parents had been keeping detailed records of their activities, including photographs, receipts, and written notes about each victim's routines and vulnerabilities. Jackson found evidence of surveillance activities going back years, showing that Harold and Margaret had been watching family members, learning their habits, and looking for opportunities to create accidents that would appear random and unfortunate. The scope of their criminal activities extended far beyond our family. Jackson traced connections to at least 12 other suspicious deaths and accidents over the past 5 years, all involving people who had known Harold and Margaret in various contexts. Some were neighbors, some were business associates, and some were family friends, but all had died under circumstances that appeared natural or accidental, while Harold and Margaret somehow benefited financially from their deaths. As Jackson compiled this evidence, I realized that David and I had been incredibly lucky to discover their plan before they could execute it completely. If I had not found that receipt on Christmas night, if we had consumed the honey as my parents had intended, we would have become just 2 more victims in a long series of carefully planned murders disguised as unfortunate coincidences. The evidence Jackson had gathered was sufficient to prove that my parents were serial killers who had been operating under the cover of family relationships for years. But gathering evidence and proving it in court were 2 different challenges, especially when the perpetrators had years of experience in covering their tracks and manipulating the people around them. I now understood that the fight I was in was not just about my own survival, but about stopping 2 people who would continue killing family members and innocent people until they were caught and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The honey they had given me was not just a murder weapon, It was evidence of a conspiracy that had already claimed multiple lives and would claim many more if left unchecked. Armed with Jackson's evidence, I thought I finally had enough proof to protect myself and stop my parents' killing spree. However, I underestimated their desperation and willingness to escalate to even more dangerous tactics when they realized their original plan was falling apart. The psychological warfare they had been waging suddenly transformed into a direct physical threat that put every member of our family in immediate danger. The escalation began when Harold started showing up at my workplace unannounced, demanding immediate meetings to discuss what he called our family financial crisis. These visits became increasingly aggressive and disruptive. During one particularly confrontational encounter in my office building's lobby, Harold grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises and threatened to make me understand the seriousness of their situation if I continued to refuse their demands for money. Harold's threats became more specific and menacing as February progressed. He told me explicitly that his criminal associates had already identified David's daily routine, including his commute route, his gym schedule, and his favorite restaurants. They knew where Rachel worked, which school Emma and Jake attended, and even which grocery store I visited every Wednesday evening. The message was clear: everyone I loved was being watched and could be targeted if I didn't cooperate. Margaret took a different but equally sinister approach by organizing what she presented as a family intervention designed to help me deal with my supposed mental health problems. She contacted relatives, family friends, and even some of my professional colleagues, telling them that I was having a psychiatric emergency and needed their support to get appropriate treatment. The intervention meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon at my aunt's house, and I was told that it would be a small gathering of people who cared about me and wanted to help. When David and I arrived, we discovered nearly 20 people crowded into the living room, all of whom had been fed Margaret's version of events and believed they were participating in a necessary mental health intervention. For 3 hours, I was subjected to a coordinated attack from people who thought they were helping me. One by one, family members and friends stood up to express their concern about my behavior, my accusations against my parents, and my supposed refusal to get professional help for my obvious psychological problems. They shared examples of how my paranoia was affecting my relationships and creating unnecessary drama within the family. Margaret had coached everyone perfectly, providing them with specific talking points and examples that made me sound unstable and dangerous. They talked about how my accusations against my loving parents were hurtful and unfounded. They expressed worry about David's well-being and suggested that he might need support to deal with being married to someone who was clearly having a mental breakdown. The most painful part was seeing how genuinely concerned these people were, not realizing they were being manipulated into participating in psychological abuse. My Aunt Sarah, who had always been like a second mother to me, actually cried as she begged me to accept help and stop hurting the people who loved me. My cousin Mark, who had been my closest friend throughout childhood, talked about how my behavior was teaching his own children that it was acceptable to make false accusations against family members. David tried to defend me and explain some of the evidence we had discovered, but the group had been primed to see any support he offered as proof that I had manipulated him into enabling my delusions. When he mentioned the forged documents and the chemical receipt, they responded with the talking points Margaret had provided about how paranoid people often create elaborate conspiracy theories to justify their irrational fears. The intervention concluded with an ultimatum: either I would voluntarily commit myself to a psychiatric facility for evaluation and treatment, or the family would pursue legal options to have me involuntarily committed for my own safety and the safety of others. They had already contacted an attorney and a psychiatrist who were prepared to initiate proceedings based on the statements they had gathered about my supposedly dangerous and erratic behavior. But my parents' backup plans extended far beyond psychological manipulation. Jackson's continued investigation revealed that they had been taking concrete steps to ensure David and I would meet with accidents if the poisoning plan failed completely. He discovered evidence that our car had been tampered with in ways designed to cause brake failure during highway driving, similar to what had happened to cousin Jennifer months earlier. The brake tampering was sophisticated and would have been nearly impossible to detect without specifically looking for signs of sabotage. The brake lines had been partially cut in a way that would cause gradual fluid loss over several days of normal driving, leading to complete brake failure at the worst possible moment. If we had not taken our car to a mechanic for routine maintenance, we would have discovered the problem only when it was too late to prevent a fatal accident. Jackson also found evidence that our home security system had been systematically compromised over several weeks. Someone with considerable technical knowledge had been accessing our security cameras, disabling motion sensors, and even unlocking doors remotely. The intrusions were subtle enough that we had not noticed anything obviously wrong, but they demonstrated that Harold's criminal associates had sophisticated capabilities for surveillance and home invasion. The most chilling discovery was a series of anonymous death threats that had been carefully orchestrated to appear random while actually being part of my parents' psychological warfare campaign. The threats arrived through various channels, including unsigned letters, untraceable phone calls, and even graffiti spray painted on the side of our garage. The content of these threats was designed to create fear and paranoia while providing my parents with plausible deniability about their involvement. But the breaking point came when Margaret made a move that revealed the true extent of her willingness to harm innocent people to achieve her goals. She began making subtle threats against Rachel's children, suggesting that accidents could happen to anyone if the family situation wasn't resolved soon. She pointed out how vulnerable Emma and Jake were, walking to school every day, playing in their apartment complex's playground, and spending time with babysitters who couldn't possibly protect them from determined criminals. Margaret's threats against the children were delivered with her characteristic emotional manipulation, presenting her concern as motherly worry rather than menacing intimidation. She would call Rachel and spend hours talking about safety concerns, sharing news stories about child abductions and accidents, and offering to help pay for additional security measures that Rachel couldn't afford on her nurse's salary. The psychological impact on Rachel was devastating. She began keeping Emma and Jake inside their apartment except for absolutely necessary trips to school and work. She installed multiple locks on their doors, covered their windows, and started sleeping in their bedroom to make sure they were safe throughout the night. The children began showing signs of stress and confusion about why their normal activities had suddenly been restricted and why their mother had become so fearful. I realized that my parents were using Rachel's children as leverage to force my compliance with their demands. They knew that I would do anything to protect Emma and Jake, even if it meant sacrificing my own safety and David's safety. The threat to innocent children was their ultimate weapon, designed to break down my resistance and force me to choose between my own life and the lives of a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. By early March, the situation had become impossible to sustain. My parents were simultaneously demanding access to my financial accounts, threatening physical violence against my family, manipulating relatives into believing I was mentally ill, and sabotaging my marriage and career. They had demonstrated that they had the capability and willingness to kill anyone who stood in the way of their financial goals, and they were using children as pawns in their deadly game. The final straw came when Harold left a voicemail message that was barely disguised as a concerned father's plea but was actually a death threat with a specific timeline. He said that he had until the end of March to resolve his financial problems, and if I didn't help him by then, he would be forced to take more drastic measures to protect himself and Margaret from the consequences of their debts. I understood that we were rapidly approaching the point where my parents would abandon subtlety entirely and move to direct violence. The honey had been their preferred method because it would have appeared natural and left them blameless, but they were clearly prepared to use much messier and more obvious tactics if necessary to achieve their goals. The clock was ticking, and I had to make a choice that would determine not just my own fate, but the fate of everyone I loved. My parents had made it clear that they would continue escalating their attacks until they either got what they wanted or eliminated everyone who stood in their way. There was no negotiating with people who had already committed multiple murders and were planning several more. The decision to give the poisoned honey to Rachel's children was the most agonizing choice I had ever faced in my life. For weeks, I had been paralyzed by the moral implications of potentially harming innocent children to protect myself and David, but my parents' escalating threats had made it clear that Emma and Jake were already targets regardless of what I did with the honey. If my parents succeeded in killing David and me, They would inherit our assets and then likely target Rachel's family next to eliminate witnesses and claim additional insurance money. Jackson had been working frantically to find information about potential antidotes for sodium fluoroacetate poisoning, consulting with toxicologists and emergency medicine specialists who might know how to counteract the effects of the neurotoxin. The research was complicated by the fact that sodium fluoroacetate was not commonly used in poisoning cases, and most medical professionals had limited experience treating patients who had been exposed to it. Dr. Elizabeth Crane, a toxicologist at the Regional Medical Center, provided the breakthrough information that gave me the courage to proceed with my desperate plan. She explained that sodium fluoroacetate poisoning was survivable if caught early and treated aggressively with specific medications and supportive care. The key was recognizing the symptoms quickly and getting the victims to a hospital where they could receive immediate intervention. The first 12 hours after exposure are critical, Dr. Crane explained during a confidential consultation that Jackson had arranged. If the patients receive appropriate treatment within that window, including gastric lavage, activated charcoal, and symptomatic support, the survival rate is actually quite good. The challenge is that the initial symptoms are often mistaken for flu or food poisoning, which delays proper treatment. Dr. Crane also provided detailed information about the specific symptoms to watch for and the exact timeline of how the poisoning would progress. She gave us a written protocol for emergency treatment that could be provided to hospital staff if the worst-case scenario occurred. Most importantly, she agreed to be available for immediate consultation if we needed expert guidance during a poisoning emergency. Armed with this information and a detailed emergency plan, I made the agonizing decision to give Rachel the honey with explicit instructions about when and how to use it. I told her that it was an expensive gift from our parents that needed to be consumed quickly before it expired, and I asked her to let Emma and Jake try it as a special treat during their afternoon snack time. The guilt of deliberately exposing my sister's children to poison was overwhelming, even though I knew it was the only way to protect all of us from my parents' larger plan. I spent the entire afternoon parked outside Rachel's apartment building with my phone in my hand, ready to call 911 the moment she contacted me about the children showing any signs of illness. 3 hours after Rachel texted me that the children had enjoyed their honey snack, she called in a panic. Emma had started vomiting and complaining about stomach pain, and Jake was becoming lethargic and confused. Both children were showing signs of nausea and were having trouble walking steadily. Rachel, with her medical training as a nurse, immediately recognized that these symptoms were serious and not typical of normal childhood illnesses. I met Rachel at the emergency room and immediately provided the medical staff with Dr. Crane's treatment protocol and contact information. I told the emergency room physician that the children had been exposed to sodium fluoroacetate and needed immediate gastric lavage and activated charcoal treatment. The medical team responded quickly and professionally, beginning aggressive treatment before the toxin could be fully absorbed into the children's systems. Dr. Crane arrived at the hospital within an hour and took over the children's care personally. She ordered specialized blood tests to measure toxin levels and coordinated with the intensive care unit to prepare for extended supportive care if needed. Her expertise and quick response were the difference between a treatable poisoning incident and a potential tragedy. While Emma and Jake were being treated in the emergency room, I called the police and reported the poisoning as an attempted murder. I provided Detective Rodriguez with all of Jackson's evidence about my parents' criminal activities, including the receipt for sodium fluoroacetate, the forged insurance documents, and the patterns of suspicious deaths that had occurred over the past several years. But my parents arrived at the hospital before the police could locate them for questioning. When Harold and Margaret walked into the pediatric intensive care unit and saw Emma and Jake connected to monitoring equipment and 4 lines, their immediate reaction was not concern for their grandchildren's well-being, but fury at me for exposing their murder plot. Harold's mask of concerned grandfather slipped completely as he realized what had happened. "What have you done?" he screamed at me in the hospital corridor, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "Those children weren't supposed to be involved in this. You've ruined everything with your selfishness and paranoia." Margaret's reaction was even more revealing. Instead of asking about Emma and Jake's condition or expressing remorse about their suffering, she immediately began calculating how this development would affect their plans. "The police will be involved now," she said to Harold, ignoring the fact that Rachel and I could hear every word. "We need to implement the backup plan immediately before they start investigating." The backup plan that Margaret referenced turned out to be even more sinister than the original poisoning scheme. Harold and Margaret had prepared an elaborate story that would frame me for deliberately poisoning my sister's children as part of a psychotic breakdown. They had forged additional documents that would make it appear that I had researched sodium fluoroacetate online and purchased it myself with the intention of harming family members. Margaret launched into her performance immediately, calling relatives and family friends to report that I had poisoned Emma and Jake in a fit of jealousy and mental illness. According to her story, I had been resentful of Rachel's children and had decided to hurt them as a way of getting revenge against my sister for some imaginary slight. She told people that I had been displaying increasingly unstable behavior for months and that this poisoning incident was the inevitable result of my untreated psychological problems. Harold supported Margaret's story by providing the forged evidence to police officers who arrived at the hospital to investigate. He presented them with fake internet search records showing that I had been researching poisons and methods of administering them without detection. He also provided what appeared to be a suicide note written in my handwriting, expressing guilt about harming innocent children and explaining that I could no longer live with what I had done. The sophistication of their frame job was terrifying. They had anticipated the possibility that their original plan might be discovered, and they had prepared a complete alternate narrative that would shift blame away from them and onto me. If Jackson had not gathered so much evidence about their criminal activities, and if Dr. Crane had not been available to provide expert testimony about the timeline and methods of the poisoning, I might have been arrested for attempted murder. Detective Rodriguez, fortunately, was experienced enough to recognize inconsistencies in Harold and Margaret's story. The timeline they provided didn't match the medical evidence about when the children had been exposed to the toxin. The forged internet search records were dated after the exposure had already occurred, which was impossible if I had supposedly researched the poison in advance. Most importantly, the suicide note was written on paper that contained fingerprints from both Harold and Margaret, suggesting that they had handled it extensively before providing it as evidence. As the evening progressed and more evidence was analyzed, the true scope of my parents' crimes became clear to law enforcement. Jackson's investigation had provided a roadmap for detectives to follow, and they were able to quickly verify many of the suspicious deaths and accidents that had occurred over the past 5 years. But even as the police were building their case against Harold and Margaret, my parents were still dangerous and unpredictable. They had demonstrated their willingness to harm children to achieve their goals, and they had backup plans that involved framing innocent people for crimes they had committed themselves. Until they were arrested and secured, everyone in our family remained at risk of violence from people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from eliminating witnesses. The next 24 hours would determine whether justice would be served or whether my parents would escape accountability for their crimes by successfully framing me for the very poisoning they had planned and executed themselves. While Emma and Jake fought for their lives in the intensive care unit, my parents activated the most sophisticated and vicious part of their plan, designed to destroy me completely while ensuring their own escape from prosecution. What I discovered over the next 48 hours was that their Christmas poisoning plot had been just one component of a much larger scheme that involved multiple backup plans, additional conspirators, and a level of premeditation that shocked even the experienced detectives who were investigating the case. The first indication that something even worse was coming happened when Detective Rodriguez called me at 6 in the morning with urgent news about my legal situation. "Bethany, you need to get down to the station immediately and bring your attorney," he said, his voice tense with concern. "Your parents have provided additional evidence that significantly complicates the case, and there's a warrant being prepared for your arrest." Harold and Margaret had spent the night after their hospital confrontation working with their criminal associates to implement what they called their nuclear option. This involved not just framing me for the poisoning of Emma and Jake, but also implicating me in the previous deaths of Uncle Thomas and Cousin Jennifer, along with several other suspicious incidents that had occurred over the past 5 years. The evidence they provided to authorities was overwhelming in its scope and sophistication. They had forged bank records showing that I had received large insurance payouts following each family member's death or accident. They had created fake email correspondence between me and hired killers, discussing payment schedules and methods for eliminating targets without detection. They had even produced what appeared to be a detailed journal written in my handwriting, documenting my supposed descent into greed-motivated violence against my own family members. Margaret's performance as the horrified mother who had finally discovered her daughter's true nature was worthy of an Academy Award. She told police that she had been suspicious about the pattern of deaths and accidents for months, but had never imagined that I could be responsible until the poisoning of Emma and Jake forced her to confront the terrible truth about what I had become. "I should have seen the signs earlier," Margaret sobbed to Detective Rodriguez, her voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine anguish. "Bethany has always been ambitious and materialistic, but I never thought she would hurt innocent people for money. When I realized that she had access to all of the victims through family relationships, and that she was the primary beneficiary of several insurance policies, I knew I had to come forward even though it broke my heart to turn in my own daughter." Harold played his role as the devastated father who was torn between love for his daughter and responsibility to protect other family members from her violence. He provided what appeared to be detailed testimony about suspicious behavior he claimed to have observed over several years, including my supposed research into various methods of causing untraceable deaths and my alleged conversations about viewing family members as financial resources rather than loved ones. But the most damaging piece of their fabricated evidence was a series of audio recordings that appeared to capture me planning and discussing the murders with unknown conspirators. The recordings were obviously fake to anyone who knew my voice well, but they were sophisticated enough to convince people who wanted to believe that I was guilty of these crimes. The recordings included conversations about timing the deaths to avoid suspicion, discussions about which family members had the most valuable insurance policies, and even what sounded like negotiations with hired killers about payment schedules and methods of assassination. Margaret and Harold claimed they had secretly recorded these conversations because they had become suspicious about my behavior and wanted to gather evidence to protect other family members. As this fabricated evidence was being presented to law enforcement, Harold and Margaret were also implementing a parallel strategy to turn the extended family completely against me. They contacted every relative, family friend, and community member they could reach, providing them with carefully edited versions of the evidence and asking for their support in ensuring that I was prosecuted to the full extent of the law. My Aunt Sarah, who had always been like a second mother to me, called that evening in tears to tell me that she could no longer have any contact with me or David. "I don't understand how you could have done these terrible things," she said, her voice filled with disappointment and horror. "Your parents showed me the evidence, and I can't ignore what's right in front of my eyes. You need professional help, and you need to confess what you've done so that the family can begin to heal." One by one, relatives and family friends contacted me to express their shock and disgust about my supposed crimes. They had all been provided with the same packet of forged evidence and the same talking points about my behavior and mental state. Many of them mentioned specific details that could only have come from Harold and Margaret, proving that my parents had been systematically contacting everyone in our social circle to ensure maximum isolation and condemnation. The most painful betrayal came when several family members agreed to provide testimony supporting my parents' version of events. My cousin Mark, who had been my closest friend throughout childhood, told police that he had observed me making suspicious comments about family members' financial situations and expressing resentment about not inheriting more money when relatives died. My Uncle Bob claimed that I had asked him detailed questions about his insurance policies and investment accounts during recent family gatherings. These testimonies were devastating because they came from people who genuinely believed they were telling the truth about observations they had made. Harold and Margaret had been planting seeds for this moment for years, making subtle comments that would later be remembered as evidence of my guilt when viewed through the lens of their fabricated narrative. The legal situation became even more complex when David found himself under pressure to cooperate with the prosecution by providing testimony against me. Detective Rodriguez and the district attorney's office suggested that David might have been an unwitting victim of my manipulation, and that he could receive immunity from prosecution if he agreed to testify about suspicious behavior he had observed during our marriage. "They're offering me a deal," David told me during one of our few opportunities to speak privately before my arrest. "They want me to testify that you've been secretive about money, that you've made comments about family members dying, and that you had access to information about everyone who was targeted. They're saying that if I don't cooperate, they'll charge me as an accessory to murder." The pressure on David was enormous. His own family was advising him to distance himself from me to protect his reputation and career. His employer was expressing concerns about having an employee who was married to an accused serial killer. The media attention surrounding the case was making it impossible for him to live a normal life, and my parents were actively encouraging him to divorce me and start over with a clean slate. Margaret, in particular, focused her attention on convincing David that he had been a victim of my deception throughout our entire relationship. She told him that everything he thought he knew about me was a lie, and that I had been using him as cover for my criminal activities while planning to eventually eliminate him once I had access to all of his assets. "You're a good man who got fooled by a very dangerous woman," Margaret told David during a private meeting that he later described to me. "Bethany has been planning your murder for months, maybe years. The only reason you're still alive is because we intervened when we did. You owe it to yourself and to future victims to help us stop her before she kills again." The systematic isolation and legal pressure were taking their toll on everyone who cared about me. Rachel, despite knowing that I had actually saved her children's lives by exposing the poisoning plot, was being pressured by relatives to cut contact with me to protect Emma and Jake from further harm. My few remaining friends were distancing themselves to avoid being associated with the scandal. Even my attorney was expressing doubts about my innocence based on the volume of evidence that Harold and Margaret had produced. By the time the arrest warrant was issued, my parents had successfully created a situation where virtually everyone in my life either believed I was guilty or was too afraid of the consequences to support me publicly. They had transformed themselves from perpetrators into victims, from criminals into heroes who had bravely exposed a serial killer in their own family. The final betrayal came when Margaret provided what she claimed was a confession letter that I had supposedly written but never sent, expressing guilt about my crimes and fear about being discovered. The letter included details about each victim and method that only the real perpetrator would know, making it appear to be authentic evidence of my guilt rather than a sophisticated fabrication designed to ensure my conviction. As police officers arrived at my house with handcuffs and an arrest warrant, I realized that my parents had successfully engineered the perfect crime. They had not only eliminated their financial problems by murdering family members for insurance money, but they had also ensured their own immunity from prosecution by framing their primary threat for all of their crimes. Harold and Margaret stood on my front lawn as I was led away in handcuffs, playing their roles as the heartbroken parents who had done their civic duty by turning in their own daughter. Margaret's tears appeared genuine to the television cameras that had gathered to document my arrest, and Harold's statements about the difficulty of accepting the truth about their child sounded sincere and painful. The media coverage painted me as a monster who had betrayed the most basic bonds of family loyalty and human decency. My parents were portrayed as tragic figures who had suffered the ultimate betrayal by someone they had loved and trusted unconditionally. The narrative was so compelling and complete that even I might have believed it if I hadn't known the truth about what had really happened. The first week in county jail was a nightmare of isolation, humiliation, and constant fear for my safety. The media coverage of my arrest had been extensive and sensationalized, painting me as a cold-blooded killer who had systematically murdered family members for financial gain. Other inmates knew about my case from television news, and many of them viewed killing children as the ultimate crime that justified vigilante justice even in prison. My court-appointed attorney, Robert Chen, was overworked and initially skeptical about my claims of innocence. He had reviewed the evidence that Harold and Margaret had provided to prosecutors, and the case against me appeared overwhelming from a legal perspective. The forged documents, fake recordings, and fabricated witness testimony created a narrative that seemed impossible to refute without concrete proof of my parents' deception. I've been doing criminal defense for 15 years, Robert told me during our first meeting. I've never seen a case with this much evidence against a defendant. Your parents have provided prosecutors with bank records, insurance documents, recorded conversations, written confessions, and witness testimony that all support their version of events. Unless you can prove that every single piece of this evidence is fabricated, which seems virtually impossible, we're looking at multiple life sentences without parole. But Jackson Mitchell had not given up his investigation, even though his client was now sitting in jail awaiting trial for murder. He continued digging into Harold and Margaret's background, financial records, and criminal associations, looking for the kind of concrete evidence that would expose their crimes and prove my innocence definitively. The breakthrough came when Jackson discovered that Harold and Margaret had made a crucial mistake in their haste to frame me completely. In their eagerness to provide overwhelming evidence of my guilt, they had created financial records showing insurance payouts that I had supposedly received following each family member's death. However, the bank accounts where these payments had allegedly been deposited were actually controlled by shell companies that Harold had established using forged identification documents. Jackson traced these shell companies through a complex web of financial transactions and discovered that all of the insurance money had ultimately flowed into accounts that Harold and Margaret had been using to pay their gambling debts and fund their lavish lifestyle. The paper trail was complicated and had been deliberately obscured, but it clearly showed that my parents were the actual beneficiaries of the insurance fraud, not me. Your parents got greedy, Jackson explained during a jail visit. They wanted to make it look like you had received millions of dollars from these deaths, but they also wanted to keep the money for themselves. The only way to do both was to create fake accounts in your name that they secretly controlled. But that created a paper trail that proves they were the ones with access to the funds, not you. Jackson's financial investigation also revealed the true extent of Harold's gambling debts and the identity of his criminal associates. The people Harold owed money to were not just loan sharks, but members of an organized crime syndicate that specialized in insurance fraud, identity theft, and contract killing. Harold and Margaret had not just been clients of this organization, they had been active participants in a criminal enterprise that had been operating for nearly a decade. The criminal associates that Jackson identified provided crucial testimony once they realized that Harold and Margaret had been planning to frame them for involvement in my supposed crimes. These career criminals had no loyalty to my parents and were willing to cooperate with law enforcement to avoid prosecution themselves. Tony Marcello, one of Harold's primary contacts in the criminal organization, provided detailed testimony about the methods and timeline of the actual murders. He confirmed that Harold and Margaret had hired professional killers to eliminate Uncle Thomas and Cousin Jennifer, using sophisticated techniques designed to make the deaths appear natural or accidental. He also provided evidence that my parents had been planning to eliminate several additional family members, including me, David, Rachel, and her children. Harold and Margaret were some of our best clients, Tony testified. They were smart, careful, and they always paid on time. They understood that this kind of work required patience and attention to detail. They never rushed a job or took unnecessary risks that might expose the operation to law enforcement. The medical evidence also began to support my version of events as forensic experts re-examined the circumstances of Uncle Thomas's death and Cousin Jennifer's accident. Dr. Elizabeth Crane's analysis of Thomas's medical records revealed clear signs of chronic poisoning that had been missed or ignored during the original autopsy. Blood samples that had been preserved from his autopsy tested positive for sodium fluoroacetate, proving that he had been murdered using the same method my parents had attempted to use on David and me. The investigation into Jennifer's car accident revealed evidence of sabotage that had been overlooked during the original insurance investigation. Brake lines had been cut in a way that caused gradual failure rather than immediate loss of function, and the work had been done by someone with professional automotive knowledge. Security footage from the garage where Jennifer's car had been serviced showed Harold meeting with mechanics who were later identified as part of the criminal organization. But perhaps the most damning evidence against my parents came from their own electronic devices and communications. Jackson obtained search warrants for their computers, phones, and email accounts, revealing a treasure trove of incriminating information that they had failed to delete properly. Email correspondence between Harold and Margaret discussed specific details about each murder, including timing, methods, and expected insurance payouts. Text messages showed them coordinating alibis and discussing how to avoid suspicion from law enforcement and family members. Internet search histories revealed extensive research into poison types, accident staging techniques, and life insurance fraud methods. Most importantly, Jackson discovered digital copies of the original documents that Harold and Margaret had used as templates for creating the forgeries that had been used to frame me. The metadata on these files proved that they had been created and modified on my parents' computers, using software that they had purchased specifically for document manipulation and identity theft. The evidence of my parents' guilt became so overwhelming that even the prosecutors who had initially been convinced of my culpability began to question their case. District Attorney Patricia Williams ordered a complete review of all evidence and witness testimony, leading to the discovery of additional inconsistencies and fabrications that further undermined Harold and Margaret's credibility. Several family members who had provided testimony supporting my parents' version of events began to recant their statements once they learned about the financial evidence and criminal organization connections. My cousin Mark admitted that Harold had coached him about what to say to police, providing specific details about conversations that had never actually occurred. My Uncle Bob revealed that Margaret had repeatedly pressured him to lie about my supposed interest in insurance policies and inheritance matters. The media narrative began to shift as defense attorneys released information about the evidence that was emerging from Jackson's investigation. News reports that had initially portrayed me as a cold-blooded killer now began to question whether I had been framed by family members who were the actual perpetrators of these crimes. The most dramatic development came when Margaret suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown during a police interview about the financial evidence. Faced with irrefutable proof that she and Harold had been the real beneficiaries of the insurance fraud, she began confessing to details about the murders that only the actual perpetrator would know. "We never meant for it to go this far," Margaret sobbed during the recorded interview. "It started with just Thomas, because he was old and sick anyway and we needed the money so desperately. But then Harold's debts kept growing, and we realized how easy it was to make these accidents look natural. We told ourselves that we were just accelerating what would have happened eventually anyway." Margaret's confession provided details about each murder and attempted murder, including the planning process, the criminal associates they had hired, and the methods they had used to cover their tracks. She also admitted that the evidence against me had been completely fabricated, and that they had spent months preparing the forgeries and fake recordings that had been used to support their frame job. Harold initially tried to deny Margaret's confession and claimed that she was having a mental breakdown that made her testimony unreliable. But the financial evidence, digital communications, and criminal associate testimony created an insurmountable case against him. When faced with the prospect of a death penalty prosecution for multiple murders, Harold finally agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a life sentence without parole. 3 months after my arrest, all charges against me were dropped and Harold and Margaret were indicted on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy. The case against them was so strong that their attorneys immediately began negotiating plea agreements to avoid death penalty prosecutions. As I walked out of county jail, I was finally free from the legal nightmare that my parents had created. But the emotional and psychological damage they had inflicted would take much longer to heal. They had not just tried to kill me, they had systematically destroyed my reputation, my relationships, and my ability to trust the people who were supposed to love and protect me. The fight for legal vindication had been won, but the fight to rebuild my life and restore my faith in family relationships was just beginning. The scars left by the ultimate betrayal from my own parents would take years of therapy, patience, and healing to overcome. 2 years have passed since that terrible Christmas morning when my parents gave us the honey that was meant to kill us, and the journey toward healing has been longer and more complicated than I ever imagined it would be. Emma and Jake made full physical recoveries from their poisoning, but the psychological impact of being used as pawns in their grandparents' deadly game required extensive therapy and support to overcome. Watching them slowly regain their trust in adults and their sense of safety in the world has been both heartbreaking and inspiring. Harold received 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders of Uncle Thomas, the attempted murders of David and me, and his role in the insurance fraud conspiracy. The judge who sentenced him called his crimes a profound betrayal of the most basic human bonds of family trust and protection. Harold showed no remorse during his sentencing hearing, maintaining that he had been driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond his control. Margaret's fate was different but equally final. Her psychological breakdown during police questioning had revealed severe mental illness that had been developing for years, possibly decades, without proper treatment. She was declared incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a maximum security psychiatric facility where she will remain for the rest of her life. The doctors who evaluated her concluded that her detachment from reality and complete lack of empathy for her victims made her permanently dangerous to society. The trial proceedings revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise for the first time. In addition to the family members they had killed and attempted to kill, Harold and Margaret had been involved in at least 8 other suspicious deaths over the past 7 years. Each case involved people they had known personally, who had trusted them, and who had valuable life insurance policies or assets that my parents could access after their deaths. The criminal organization that had provided the actual killers and technical support for these murders was dismantled by federal law enforcement agencies working together across multiple states. Tony Marcello and several other conspirators received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation with prosecutors, but most of them still received substantial prison terms for their roles in the murders and fraud schemes. Justice in the legal system was one thing, but healing the damage to our family relationships proved to be much more challenging and ongoing. Many relatives who had believed Harold and Margaret's lies about me struggled to accept the truth about what had really happened, even when faced with overwhelming evidence of my parents' guilt and my innocence. My Aunt Sarah eventually apologized for cutting contact with me, but our relationship has never fully recovered the closeness we once shared. She explained that she had been so thoroughly convinced by Margaret's performance as the concerned mother that she found it difficult to trust her own judgment about people anymore. Several other family members simply disappeared from our lives entirely, unable to cope with the knowledge that they had been manipulated into supporting serial killers against an innocent family member. David has been my strongest supporter throughout this entire ordeal, but our marriage was tested in ways that we never could have anticipated. The stress of being accused of murder, spending months in jail, and having our entire lives scrutinized by law enforcement and media took a toll on both of us that required professional counseling to address properly. "I never doubted your innocence," David told me during one of our therapy sessions, "but I did doubt whether our marriage could survive this kind of trauma. I wasn't sure if we would be able to rebuild trust and intimacy after everything we'd been through." The therapy helped us work through the anger, fear, and sense of violation that we both felt, and our relationship has ultimately become stronger than it was before the crisis. Rachel and I have grown closer through this shared experience of surviving my parents' betrayal and violence. She credits me with saving her children's lives by exposing the poisoning plot, even though it required the agonizing decision to deliberately put Emma and Jake at risk to protect them from greater danger. Our bond as sisters has been strengthened by the knowledge that we protected each other when it mattered most. The financial recovery took nearly 2 years to complete, as attorneys worked to trace and recover the insurance money that Harold and Margaret had stolen through their fraud schemes. Most of the money was eventually returned to the legitimate beneficiaries, including the estates of Uncle Thomas and other victims. The legal fees consumed a significant portion of the recovered funds. I returned to work at my marketing company after my name was cleared, but the experience had changed my perspective on career success and material goals in ways that made my old priorities seem shallow and meaningless. I eventually left corporate marketing to start a nonprofit organization that provides support services for families who have been victimized by financial fraud and elder abuse. The nonprofit work has been deeply fulfilling in ways that my corporate career never was. Helping other families navigate the legal system, connect with mental health services, and rebuild their lives after being betrayed by people they trusted has given meaning and purpose to the suffering that David and I endured. Emma and Jake are now 8 and 6 years old, bright and resilient children who have processed their traumatic experience with the help of specialized therapy for young victims of violence. They understand in age-appropriate terms that their grandparents were sick people who made very bad choices, and that sometimes adults who are supposed to protect children make mistakes or do harmful things. The children's recovery has been aided by the strong support system that Rachel has built around them, including new friendships with families who understand their situation and teachers who are aware of their needs for additional emotional support. Emma has shown particular resilience and has even expressed interest in becoming a doctor someday to help other children who get sick from bad people. One of the most difficult aspects of the healing process has been learning to trust family relationships again after experiencing the ultimate betrayal from the people who were supposed to love and protect me unconditionally. Therapy has helped me understand that Harold and Margaret's actions reflected their own psychological problems and moral failures, not some fundamental flaw in the concept of family bonds. I've learned to distinguish between the healthy family relationships that provide love, support, and mutual respect, versus the toxic relationships that are based on manipulation, control, and exploitation. This distinction has helped me appreciate the people who stood by us during our darkest moments while letting go of relationships with people who proved themselves to be unreliable or harmful. David and I decided not to have children of our own, partly because of the financial and emotional costs of the legal battle, but mostly because we wanted to focus our parenting energy on being the best aunt and uncle we could be to Emma and Jake. We've become deeply involved in their lives, providing stability, support, and the kind of unconditional love that they should have received from their grandparents. The media attention surrounding the case eventually died down, but the experience taught me about the power of narrative and the importance of controlling your own story when facing public scrutiny. Harold and Margaret had been masterful at manipulating the narrative to make themselves appear sympathetic while painting me as a villain, and it took years of careful public relations work to restore my reputation completely. Looking back on this experience now, I recognize that my survival was due to a combination of luck, preparation, and the support of people who refused to abandon me even when the evidence seemed overwhelming. If I had not found that receipt on Christmas night, if Jackson had not been such a thorough investigator, if Dr. Crane had not been available to provide medical expertise, or if David had not stood by me throughout the legal proceedings, the outcome could have been very different. The experience has taught me that evil often comes disguised as love, concern, and family loyalty. The most dangerous people are often those who know us best and have access to our vulnerabilities, our routines, and our trust. Learning to recognize the warning signs of manipulation and exploitation has become a crucial life skill that I now share with others through my nonprofit work. But I've also learned about the power of truth, persistence, and courage in the face of seemingly impossible odds. When the entire world seemed to believe that I was a killer, when my own family had turned against me, and when the legal system appeared to be stacked against me, the truth eventually emerged through the dedicated work of people who refused to give up. Today, as I write this story, David and I are preparing for a quiet Christmas celebration with Rachel, Emma, and Jake. We'll exchange simple gifts, share a home-cooked meal, and create new traditions that emphasize gratitude, honesty, and genuine care for each other's well-being. There will be no expensive honey from mysterious European suppliers, no elaborate performances designed to manipulate emotions, and no hidden agendas driven by greed or desperation. The children will receive age-appropriate gifts that reflect their actual interests and personalities, not calculated attempts to create obligation or debt. We'll spend time together because we genuinely enjoy each other's company, not because we're gathering intelligence for future exploitation. And we'll share our love openly and honestly, without the poison of deception that my parents had been injecting into our family relationships for years. The scars from this experience will always be part of our family's story, but they no longer define us or control us. We've learned that survival is not just about staying alive, but about maintaining your humanity, your values, and your capacity for love even when facing the worst that people can do to each other. I want to leave you with this question: have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely, and how did you rebuild your ability to trust others afterward? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, Because healing from betrayal is something that connects all of us as human beings. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories about survival, resilience, and the power of truth to overcome deception. And please share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's possible to survive even the most devastating family betrayals and build a life filled with authentic love and genuine safety. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you recognize and protect yourself from the wolves who sometimes wear the masks of the people who claim to love you most.